have with us this evening our guest speaker, Mr. Randal O'Toole. Mr. O'Toole is an American policy analyst and senior fellow with the Cato Institute, who over the past 20 years has become nationally recognized expert on the serious economic realities of high-speed rail developments and their true costs. He is the author of 5 books on the failures of government planning, specifically in the areas of land use and transportation issues. He has written several critiques analyzing the feasibility of high-speed rail, light rail, streetcars, and other controversial transportation system proposals, many of which you can go onto the website at the www.cato Institute or cato.org and download those presentations to read for yourself. Prior to Mr. O'Toole's work for the Cato Institute, he taught environmental economics at Yale University, which, by the way, I don't know if you heard this as an aside, but Cato Institute just released that 18 years in a row we have not had any increase in the climate, in the temperature, the global temperature. But that's an aside. But Institute, he taught environmental economics at Yale University, University of California, Berkeley, and Utah State University. A lifelong resident of Oregon, he currently serves at Camp Sherman, a small community in the Oregon Cascades Mountains. Would you please warmly welcome Mr. Randal O'Toole.
Well, at the Cato Institute, I'm known as the Cato Institute's official rail nut because I love trains, I love passenger trains. I helped restore the steam locomotive, which is the the world's second most powerful operating steam locomotive. I'm also a bicycling nut. I not only bicycle all over the Cascade Mountains in Oregon, but I bring a folding bicycle with me when I travel. I bicycled 100 miles over the weekend in the Twin Cities. So when you talk about high-speed rail, actually I don't think we need both of these, just need one. When you talk about rail, it seems like I would be the kind of person who would support it. However, I'm also an economist, and I have to ask who benefits and who pays, what are the real costs, and do the benefits exceed the costs? And these kinds of questions need to be asked whenever we're talking about rail transit or any transportation policy. 50 years ago, almost all transportation in this country was paid for exclusively out of user fees. Gas taxes paid for roads. Fares paid for transit. Airline ticket fees paid for airports. Both fares and shipping costs paid for passenger and freight rail. So we paid for things out of user fees, and in the last 50 years we've gotten away from that to the point where almost no transportation is paid for out of user fees. Most transportation is subsidized, and although the subsidies are not at all equal, and because of that, we lost the connections between the transportation providers and transportation users. So the providers, instead of saying, how can we efficiently provide transportation for our users, they're saying, how can we spend lots and lots of money to keep our unions and our contractors happy so that they can always have wastefully expensive transportation projects to build. One of the most wastefully expensive transportation projects they want to build is high-speed rail. Japan built a high-speed rail line in 1964, the first rail line going 150 miles an hour. At that time, up until that time, the fastest trains in the world had been in the United States, which had gone 110 to 120 miles an hour with trains between Chicago and the Twin Cities routinely. But the federal government shut that down in 1950 when they issued rules saying trains couldn't go faster than 79 miles an hour for safety reasons. So in 1964, Japan builds a high-speed rail line from Tokyo to Osaka. And it was an enormous success, partly because at the time, 40 million people lived in this corridor. But it was also partly a success because at that time, only about 11% of travel in Japan was by automobile. Almost none was by air. More than 70% was by low-speed conventional trains. So when they built the high-speed trains, virtually all the passengers on those trains were people who were previously riding low-speed trains. They continued to build high-speed trains and after many years, the percentage of people who are riding trains has decreased from 70% to a little more than 25%. Meanwhile, the percentage of people driving has increased from 11% to 60%. You can see all these high-speed trains didn't get people out of their cars. You can look at the trajectory. Rail goes down at the same rate that automobile goes up. Building high-speed trains in Japan did not get people out of their cars. It may have slowed the decline of low-speed trains, but it didn't stop it at all. The same thing happened in Europe. In 1980, there were almost no high-speed trains in Europe, and at that time, automobile was dominant, but the railroads carried 8% of travel in Europe. Since then, France, Germany, Italy, and a bunch of other countries have built high-speed trains, and today, the percentage of travel that goes by rail in Europe is down to 6%. Actually, it's down to 5% today, but as of 2000, it was 6%. So the percentage of travel by rail continues to decline. Well, that might do it. Maybe I'll just walk over here. So building high-speed trains doesn't work in Europe either. If by work, it means getting people out of their cars. So in the United States, we have virtually no travel by low-speed trains. It's less than 1% of all travel. Barely 0.5% of all travel is by Amtrak. So who's going to be the market for a high-speed train? If there's nobody riding a low-speed train, there is no market for high-speed trains. You're not going to get very many travelers. Now, after Japan built the first high-speed rail line that actually made money, they continued to build lines, and most of the lines afterwards lost money. They got more and more expensive, they carried fewer and fewer passengers, and yet there was political pressure to build more lines. The same thing has happened in Italy, in Spain, and other countries. Spain built a line that they actually shut down because it was costing $20,000 a day to operate, and it carried an average of 9 passengers a day. So they spent hundreds of millions building the line and no longer even try to operate it. Now we see this kind of political pressure in President Obama's high-speed rail plan. Here's the original plan. The red lines on here show the original set of networks. It wasn't one network because they didn't connect with each other, of high-speed rail lines he proposed. It was about 12,500 miles. And then a couple of years later, they came out with a new map. This new map included such vital lines as Minneapolis to Duluth, and of course the crucial Cheyenne to Albuquerque to El Paso corridor. That was certainly a vital corridor, and on and on and on. Oklahoma City to Tulsa. Basically, everywhere there was a powerful politician got a high-speed rail line on the map. Doesn't mean that it got it funded, but it got it on the map. Curiously, there's no line from the Twin Cities to Rochester. Now, Amtrak has a high-speed train of sorts. It goes at top speed of 150 miles an hour. It's sneered at by the real high-speed rail aficionados that say you should go at least 180 or 200 miles an hour to be considered a true high-speed train. But it's faster than driving, it's faster than the bus, and it serves a corridor of about 40 million people, about the same as the Tokyo to Osaka corridor. It's the densest corridor in America, and they claim it makes a profit. Well, it does make a profit as long as you don't count the capital costs, you don't count the maintenance costs, because Amtrak, violating generally accepted accounting principles, has decided that maintenance is a capital cost and not an operating cost, and you shift a lot of the operating costs that you do count to other trains, because they do have low-speed trains in the same corridor as the high-speed trains. So again, all they did is they took people out of the low-speed trains and put them on the high-speed trains. The cost of these trains is very high. The fares alone on Amtrak's Acela, the high-speed trains, are 75 cents a passenger mile. Compare that with the average airline fare today, which is 15 cents a passenger mile, or the average Amtrak fare everywhere else, which is 30 cents a passenger mile. They're charging a premium to take the high-speed train. When you count the subsidies, they're huge for Amtrak. They're at least 30 cents a passenger mile for Amtrak, and probably more for the high-speed train. For airlines, for buses, for cars, subsidies average about a penny a passenger mile, a lot less than the 30 cents for Amtrak. The only thing that's worse than Amtrak is public transit, where the subsidies average about 75 cents a passenger mile or more. So if the airfare for, the fare for an Amtrak high-speed train is 75 cents a passenger mile, how does that compare against airfares? Well, Delta Airlines, of course, has service between Rochester and the Twin Cities, and it's really hard to figure out what their airfare is. If you fly just from here to the Twin Cities and don't go any further, it's $200. That sounds like a lot. But suppose you go from here to Seattle, it's $217, $18. So are you telling me that it's only $17 to fly from Minneapolis to Seattle? Obviously not. What if you're just flying from Minneapolis to Seattle? It's $120. So are you telling me that the Minneapolis to Rochester is $81? It's really hard to tell what the real fare is. But in Europe, they have a whole flock of low-cost air carriers, Ryanair, EasyJet, a bunch of others, and they are extremely cheap. They're like Southwest Airlines used to be when it was a cheap airline. For example, they have fares of about the same number of miles as here to the Twin Cities. Fares of $53, $47. One route is even only $24. So I think $50 is probably a reasonable fare for here to Minneapolis if there was demand and if there was competition. In other words, if there was a high-speed train, and even if Delta was the only airline, they would probably lower their fares to about $50 to compete with the high-speed train. That would eliminate any kind of advantage that the high-speed train would have, because the high-speed train fare would have to be at least $75, or close to $75 if you go at 75 cents a mile. So you can talk about high-speed trains and say they've got an advantage over airlines, but they really don't. What President Obama really wanted when he proposed the idea of high-speed trains was to leave a legacy for the future. He wanted to be remembered the way we remember Dwight Eisenhower. The interstate highway system is sometimes called the Eisenhower highway system because it was supposedly thought up by him. In fact, it wasn't. It was thought up by bureaucrats in the Bureau of Public Roads who put many years of effort into planning the system, and they came up with a system of about 40,000. It ended up being expanded to about 45,000 miles of roads, ended up costing in today's dollars, about $450 billion, a little less than $500 billion. Now, about 20% of all of our passenger travel and about 15% of all of our freight goes on interstate highways. So it's a lot of money, but the interstate highways only represent about 2% of all the roads in America, and yet they're carrying far more than 2% of both passenger and freight travel. Now, how do we compare that with President Obama's vision of high-speed rail? He wants to build 12,500 miles, or maybe more if we count Minneapolis to Duluth. And notice they're not a connected network. You can't get from Chicago to Seattle or Chicago to Los Angeles or even Chicago to New York on high-speed trains. You can only go these short distances. And when President Obama proposed to build this system, Congress just gave him the money right away. That was a huge difference from in 1955 when President Eisenhower proposed the interstate highway system. Congress wanted to know, where's the money going to come from? It's going to come from gas taxes? Okay. Are we going to pay as you go, or are we going to sell a bunch of bonds and hope the gas taxes come in to pay for it? Congress said, no, we're not going to sell bonds. We're only going to pay as you go. So if we don't get enough gas taxes in, it's just going to take longer to build. And that's actually what happened. Costs went up a little bit because of inflation, and so it took longer to build than they expected, but eventually they did get it all built. They also wanted to know who's really going to use this. Is this going to be used by just a few people, or is it going to be used by everybody? And it turned out it pretty much is used by everybody. When it came to the high-speed rail, President Obama asked for Congress to give him $8 billion in 2009 and more money in 2010. Congress never asked, well, how much is this whole system going to cost? And it turns out, when somebody finally asked the question, it's going to cost $500 billion, more than the entire interstate highway system, even though there's fewer miles and they aren't connected. Congress never asked how we were going to pay for it. Certainly isn't going to come from user fees. Nobody, not even high-speed rail advocates, think that user fees are going to cover even the operating costs, much less the capital cost of it. Did they ask who's going to ride it? It turns out high-speed rail kind of makes sense if you're going from downtown to downtown of cities that are close together, but who lives downtown? Who works downtown? Hardly anybody anymore. Only about 8% of Americans work downtown, only about 0.5% of Americans live downtown, so we're serving a very small market to start with, and guess what? The people who live downtown tend to have higher incomes than average because they work in finance and real estate and insurance, and so we're actually subsidizing the wealthy. And then Congress never asked, did the benefits exceed the cost? They just gave them $8 billion without asking these questions at all. Now, what are the costs going to be? We don't have a good estimate of the cost of building a line from Twin Cities to Rochester. But California is building a line, they're going to start building, they say, next year in the California Central Valley. They're building it from nowhere to nowhere because that's all the money they have. Technically, they're building it from Corcoran, where Charlie Manson lives, to Borden, which is a ghost town. And the land they're building it on is extraordinarily flat, much flatter than Minnesota. And because it's so flat, it's really cheap to build. They say it's only going to cost $7.6 billion for 114 miles, which is $66.6 million a mile. Or as somebody pointed out to me recently, about $800 an inch. Now, if the Minneapolis to Rochester line cost that much, it turns out it would be cheaper to buy 8,000 round-trip tickets per day on Delta Airlines forever than it would be to build this line. Now, there haven't been any really good projections as to how many people this would carry, but the closest thing was somebody said, well, if we run the trains often and we fill 65% of the seats, that would carry 7,500 people a day, one way. So we can carry more than twice as many one way, or that many round trip for less than the cost of high-speed rail. Now, the advocates of high-speed rail say, well, high-speed rail promotes economic development. Their logic for this is, to me, rather peculiar. They looked at the interstate highway system, which vastly increased American mobility. It made it made it possible for Americans to get to where they want to go faster, cheaper, and more conveniently than before we had the interstates. Before we had the interstates, the average American traveled about 4,000 miles per year by car. Now that we have interstates, we're traveling 15,000 miles a year by car. The gain did not mean a decline in travel on other roads. They both increased. So we've got all this travel, this new travel, and when you get new travel that's cheaper and faster and more convenient, then you get economic development because you're getting productivity out of that new travel. You can take your wares to market, you can find better jobs, you can do all kinds of things that make you more productive, and that's what generates economic development. High-speed rail doesn't do that. High-speed rail is going to be slower than flying, it's going to be less convenient than driving, and it's going to be more expensive than either one. So it's not going to generate economic development, it's going to drag down your economy instead. In fact, the high-speed rail advocates are proud of the fact that it's not going to increase mobility. They say we're going to get 90% of the travelers on high-speed rail were people who formerly drove, and 10% will be people who formerly flew. So we're not going to get any new mobility, we're just going to get people out of cheaper, more convenient forms of transportation onto more expensive, slower, less convenient forms of transportation. Really, what they want to do is not generate economic development They want to change American lifestyles. Right now, we're spread out. They call it sprawl. Because we're spread out so much, it's very hard to move people in large quantities by train. So they want people to live in more compact developments. And part of their scheme is they're going to build high-speed rail and then rezone everything around the train stations to really high-density development and try to get more and more people to live in those developments. Now, they always have pretty pictures that are architects' conceptions of what these developments are going to look like. You know, with lots of trees and flowers and plazas and everything else. And then you build it, and this is what it looks like. Now, to be truthful, this is in the former Soviet era of East Germany. Here's the one I was going to show you. This is in Portland, Oregon. It's right next to a light rail line. The difference is that the one in East Germany, as soon as the East Germans got their freedom, they all went out and moved into the single-family homes, and so the development I showed you was slated to be torn down when I took that picture. Meanwhile, in Portland, they've drawn an urban growth boundary around the city and made single-family housing unaffordable to most people, so more people were having to live in high-density development like this. Now, they call this a transit-oriented development because they want you to ride the light rail. There's a light rail station right behind this building. They want you to ride the light rail everywhere. But you see those cars parked there? See that little red sign? It says no parking, fire lane. Because they only put in 2/3 of a parking place per dwelling unit. You see those cars parked there? See that red line? They're parked on the sidewalk. The managers of this development know that if they enforce the parking rules, lots and lots of people would move out and it'd be really hard to rent the spaces. We stood out in front of this development and other high-density developments in Portland, that all of which incidentally were subsidized. This received about $13 million in subsidies, and counted how people leave in the morning. We assume they're going to work, so we say, are they taking light rail, are they taking bus, are they bicycling, walking, or driving? Well, guess what? Just as many drive from this development as from any place else in Portland. This is not a transit-oriented development. It's an automobile-oriented development, just like any other. Here's another that they want to build. The curious thing is, notice it's 4 to 5 stories tall. For some reason, planners have become enamored with 4 to 5 story buildings. It was because, in fact, in the 50s, they were building skyscrapers for people, and it turned out to be a total disaster, and they had to blow most of them up. And they don't want low rises, because that's not dense enough. They want some density, so they go for 4 to 5 story buildings. Between about 1900 and 1990, there were almost no 4 to 5 story buildings built in the United States. Because if you build more than 3 stories, you have to put in an elevator. And if you put in an elevator, it only pays off if you build more than 6 stories. So 4 to 5 story buildings were very rare. But the planners decreed that 4 to 5 story buildings should be built. And so they zone everything around rail stations for 4 to 5 story buildings. And developers will build it if they get a subsidy enough to cover the cost of the elevator that they have to put in that won't be covered because it's not enough density there. Now, another argument for high-speed rail is that it's going to be electrically powered, and so it's going to save us all kinds of fossil fuels and pollution that comes from fossil fuels. Of course, the electricity we use comes from burning fossil fuels. Now, that's not true in the Pacific Northwest. We get a lot of electricity from hydroelectric dams, but most of the rest of the country gets most of their electricity from burning one fossil fuel or another. And so you're not saving energy, and you're not reducing pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. Now, 40, 50 years ago, you might have been able to save energy because at that time, cars and airplanes were gas guzzlers. But they have both become far more fuel efficient today than they were 50 years ago. Meanwhile, trains have been getting hardly any more fuel efficient at all. Over the next 50 years, it's predicted that cars will become probably far more fuel efficient than they are today, and airplanes are supposed to become even more fuel efficient per passenger mile. Meanwhile, rail is going to be a little bit more fuel efficient. I've made a straight line here, but it should decline just a little bit. But probably by 2020, trains will be the brown form of travel, and true blue environmentalists will be encouraging people to stop riding trains and start driving because driving will be so much more fuel efficient. Now, trains actually make a lot of sense for freight. You take a 50-ton freight car, you can load it with 100 tons of freight, and that means you're moving a lot of live load for every pound or ton of dead load that you're having to carry. Freight makes sense, especially if you can move a large quantity from point A to point B, like coal from a mine to a power plant, grain from an elevator to a port, containers from a port to a place where they're distributed to trucks. So if you can move a lot from point A to point B, freight makes sense, partly because it's you don't have to do a lot of switching, and partly because there's such a high payload compared to the dead load. Passenger trains are completely different. People don't want to all be in point A moving to point B. They're in a lot of different places. And you take a 50-ton passenger car, and Amtrak's high-speed passenger cars are actually 63 tons. You fill it with passengers, you're lucky to have about 10 tons. Usually you're going to have about 5 or 6 tons of passengers on there. So that means that the dead load for every pound of payload is going to be very high, and it takes a lot of energy to start that dead load, move it up to the high speeds, and then slow it down, move it up to high speeds every time you make a stop and start again. So high-speed rail is very energy intensive, probably more energy intensive than flying today, although we don't have a lot of experience with it outside of Amtrak. But that's one reason why when Florida wrote their environmental impact statement for a high-speed rail line from Tampa to Orlando, they concluded that, quote, the environmentally preferred alternative is the no-build alternative. And initially, after they wrote this environmental impact statement, they decided not to build it. And then Obama comes along and says, anybody who's written an environmental impact statement, I'll give you the money to build a high-speed rail line. So Florida said, well, we've got one. Screw the environment. Let's build it, as long as you're paying for it. And then a Republican governor got elected and he gave the money back, fortunately. But part of the issue is that high-speed rail advocates don't seem to really care about the environment that much. They just want to get the trains built. And part of it is that when you actually sit down and do the analysis, you find there are no environmental benefits. Now, the U.S. Federal Railroad Administration published a strategic plan for high-speed rail. And on about page 2 of the plan, they said, high-speed rail has a comparative advantage in certain markets. If you're going less than 100 miles, then driving or commuter rail has the comparative advantage. If you're going more than 600 miles, then driving or airlines have a comparative advantage. But between 100 miles and 600 miles, high-speed rail has a comparative advantage because it's faster than going to the airport, going through security, and blah, 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 and it's cheaper somehow. It's faster than driving as well. So, according to them, 100 to 600 miles is what they call the sweet spot for high-speed rail. Now notice, it's not more than 100 miles from here to Minneapolis. It's less. So you're already out of the running according to the Federal Railroad Administration's own criteria for what makes sense. But I don't even believe that high-speed rail makes sense in that 100 to 600 mile area. I think auto travel makes more sense in high-speed rail up to 300 or 400 miles, and depending on the person, 500 or 600 miles. And air travel makes more sense in high-speed rail for 175 miles or more. For example, between Portland and Seattle, we have about 30 or 40 flights a day. That's 175 miles. So why would anybody take a high-speed train, especially since they spent $700 million increasing the speed of their trains from 54 to 56 miles an hour? How much is it going to cost to get a really high-speed train there? When we look at Amtrak's Acela, the high-speed train from Boston to Washington, Amtrak brags, our trains carry more people than the airlines between Boston and Washington. Yes, but when you count all forms of travel, including buses and cars, the Acela only carries 2% of the market share between Boston and Washington. The low-speed trains that Amtrak has carries another 4%, airlines about 5%, buses about 6%, and driving carries more than 80% of travel. So Amtrak is not able to compete, and we're talking about travel markets that are about 250 miles from New York to Boston, about 250 miles from New York to Washington. Amtrak can't compete against driving. It really can't compete against buses in those markets. And it's only barely competing against air. The real problem is that rail needs a lot of infrastructure. And that infrastructure is very expensive. Airlines don't need a lot of infrastructure. You need airports, and other than that, you've got vehicles, planes, and the only infrastructure they need is air. Air is pretty cheap. Another kind of vehicle that doesn't need much new infrastructure is buses. Megabus has revolutionized the bus industry. They've done it by shedding infrastructure. They don't use bus stations. They don't use baggage handlers. They don't have ticket sales offices. You buy your tickets on the internet. You pay as low as $1 a fare to go from here to Chicago or from New York to Washington. As they sell more tickets, the price goes up, but the top price is never very expensive. It costs $149 to take Amtrak's Acela one way from New York to Washington. It cost, I recently went round trip, that same trip, for $17 on the Megabus. And if you don't like Megabus, which has, every seat has free Wi-Fi, every seat has a plug for to put in your iPad or your laptop or whatever, if that's not good enough for you, there are other first-class buses called, one company is called Limo Liner. They take a 55-passenger bus and take out half the seats. There's only 28 seats. They have videos. They have meal service on board. Very comfortable, all leather seats. And it costs about $50 to go from Boston to New York. So it's also very cheap compared to Amtrak, and yet it doesn't take that much longer to do it. In the long run, we're going to see another revolution in our transportation system. And that revolution has been heralded by Google, which has been running self-driving cars in California for more than 700,000 miles. The only accident they've had is when somebody rear-ended them at a stoplight. Their cars have all kinds of sensors on board. On top you see a laser beam that spins around at 200 times a second. There's also infrared sensors. What happened? Why did we stop? Oh. There's also infrared sensors and optical sensors so they can see everything around them. Most traffic congestion is caused by slow human reflexes. So when we substitute computer reflexes for human reflexes, we're going to be able to put at least 3 times as many vehicles on the road, which is going to mean we don't need to build a lot more roads. In addition, anybody is going to be able to drive. You won't have to be 16 years old and have a driver's license to drive. You can be 9 years old, you can be 90 years old. I'm looking forward to putting my dogs in the car and sending them to the vet. The vet doesn't want to see me, they only want to see the dogs. With reduced congestion, there's going to be increased speeds, which means we're going to have a lot more productivity because we'll be able to reach more jobs and employers will have access to more workers. It'll be far safer. We'll probably reduce traffic fatalities by 80 to 90%. And because we'll be able to build cars lighter, it'll be greener transport as well. Now this is an example of what Volkswagen calls the valet parking option on your driverless car. You get to work or you get to a hotel or a restaurant, you get out of your car and you say, "Car, go park yourself." So the car has a database of all available parking spots in it, and it drives around until it finds an empty one, and then it parks itself in there. Now you might decide you don't want to have your car park itself. You might say, "Car, drive home and pick up my spouse and take them to work. Or pick up my kids and take them to school. Or car, go get your oil changed. Or car, go sign up with Uber and make me some money while I'm not using you." But in any case, whenever you're done with work or with the restaurant or wherever you're at, you pull out your smartphone, which has a GPS in it, and you push the app and you say, "Car, come." And the car will zone in on your GPS and come and pick you up wherever you are in just a minute or two. Now, you combine self-driving cars with Uber and Lyft and all these other apps, and then you're going to realize the car, driving a car today costs about 1/4 as much as a high-speed train. You're going to say, why is anybody going to need a high-speed train or any kind of train at all when they can just call up, using Uber, call up a shared car that's self-driving. It's going to change the way we think about travel. Traveling by car imposes two costs on us. The first cost is the cost of the car and the insurance and the gasoline and so on. And the second cost is the cost of our time sitting in the car, stressed out by the traffic, dealing with having to worry about kids running in front of the car and everything else. If instead we have a car that's driving for us, then it's going to change the way we think about driving. The cost of driving in terms of our time falls to nearly zero. We can work on the internet in the car, we can watch entertainment on DVDs, we can play Parcheesi with our kids, we can train our dogs stupid dog tricks, do all kinds of things in the car while it's taking us somewhere, and we don't have to worry about it at all. You can buy a car today that's what I call 90% self-driving. It has almost all the sensors that the Google car has on board, and it does things like what's called adaptive cruise control, which means it locks in on the car in front of you and keeps a fixed distance behind that car, so you don't have to worry about colliding with it. It has what's called lane keeping, which means it sees the stripes on the road and steers for you between those stripes. It has something called vehicle collision avoidance, which means it has little sensors all around the car, and if you try to change lanes, whether there's another car already located, or if another car has you in their blind spot, they try to change lanes into you, your car will brake or do whatever it takes to avoid the collision. You take a car like this that you can buy today for as little as $26,000, and when the software is available for a totally driverless car, turning this car into a driverless car will be a software upgrade. Maybe you'll have to add a couple of sensors. That means, to me, we're going to have a rapid transformation. They predict the software. Google says it's going to have its software available for commercial use by 2017. Nissan has promised they'll have their driverless cars on the market by 2020. Most people think 2020 is a reasonable date. The next thing that's going to happen is you're going to see cars built without any steering wheel, accelerator, or brake pedals. Google has this car, and they're building 100 of them, which they're getting licensed to test in California. They're going to drive them all over California. All it has is a button. You tell the car where you want to go, and you push a button, and it starts, and it takes you there. This gentleman is blind. You saw little kids getting in it. Anybody will be able to use it, and California has passed new rules that say we're going to license the car, we're not going to license the driver. So it doesn't matter who's driving the car is doing the driving. And once they've given the car a license, that's all that's necessary. As far as insurance goes, they're saying the insurance companies aren't going to license you, they're going to license the man, they're not going to insure you, they're going to insure the manufacturer. So the auto manufacturer will buy the liability insurance, and you'll pay a little bit extra for your car. When you get it, you won't have to worry about insurance payments or premiums or what happens. So self-driving cars are going to be available in about 6 years, probably sooner. By 2030, you'll be able to buy cars like this one. By 2040, they'll start making it illegal to have human-driven cars on the highways because they're too dangerous. And we're talking about building a high-speed rail line that won't even be completed for many years. And once it's done, you're going to be stuck with it for at least 30 years. Because it takes that long for everything to wear out, and that before you get to replace it with new technology, which is going to cost a whole lot more. So, well before the high-speed rail line reaches the end of its normal lifespan, it's going to be totally replaced by self-driving cars and by Uber-type apps that will allow anybody to go anywhere, anytime they want, at very little cost to themselves. Now, I talk about all these issues in a book that I've written, so here's a shameless self-promotion. Cato published this book. They sell it for $25. Honesty compels me to tell you that you can buy a Kindle version for $13 online, but you won't get my autograph. So I brought a few copies with me, and I'm hoping that I can sell them today because I don't want to have to carry them back. I've been on the road for the last month, and these are my last 5 copies, and I don't have room in my luggage to carry them back. So I'm selling them for $20, and that includes the autograph. If you don't want to spend $20, go to cato.org. And I have papers on high-speed rail, I have papers on light rail, I have papers on buses, I have papers on self-driving cars. They're all downloadable for free, and I go into quite a bit of detail on each of these subjects. You can email me anytime at rot@cato.org. You can go to my blog, which is called The Anti-Planner. It's ti.org/anti-planner, or just Google anti-planner. I'm the first thing on the list. And on the blog, up in the upper right-hand corner, I have a button, a menu item called Presentations. You can click on that and download my presentations on high-speed rail as well as on other subjects. So that you can feel free to steal from those presentations and show them to your friends to help convince them that high-speed rail is a bad idea. Well, that concludes my formal